I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and we're going to try to give you as much information as possible. This won't be the last meeting, but it's our first live meeting, so thank you, and I'll just stay back here and try to deal with these people that are trying to get in. So thank you. Mary Beth Bianconi.
I just want to thank everybody for coming. And, it's been a different type of year, as we all know. We still continue to go forward and take steps towards looking at Salem for water quality, economics, and having everybody come back home and have jobs and quality of life. So a big thank you to Herb Perkins, because he's been the mover and shaker in keeping us all going in the same direction, and I can't thank him enough for all that he does. Mary Beth and Tracy, thank you so much for coming. We wouldn't be able to do it without the two of you and Candace. I think we have meetings at least, it seems like once a month, every 3 weeks, and thank you for your time and your service to Salem. We really appreciate it.
So hello everyone. My name is Mary Beth Bianconi, and I'm a partner at an engineering firm here locally, Delaware Engineering. We've been working with the community for a little over a year, trying to sort through some of these very early stages of contemplating a sewer system for the community. And tonight we have 3 different presenters. And what we'd like to do is run through the presentations first, because we know there'll be questions, but we hope that the presentation materials might answer some of those questions. And then when we're finished, we'll do the traditional Q&A. So Tracy Letter, who is my colleague, who is the senior environmental scientist with our firm, is going to start us off by talking about hydrogeology and flooding here in the area, because we know that that's a really important topic. I'm going to pick up and talk a little bit about sewers, kind of big picture ideas. There isn't anything super specific right now for Salem, but we can, in question and answer, if we have a specific question, we can definitely get to that. And then Candace Balmer, who is from OurCAP Solutions, has been working with the community on an income survey, is going to clean up and bring us home with a discussion about the income survey and the importance of that.
Basically, what I want to try to do is talk about some of the basics of water and how water works, because we're going to be talking about water, a little bit about flooding, and then we're going to go talk about sewage, which is also the other end of water. So water is a whole cycle, and people need water to live. It's, sorry, my favorite element. Don't mean to diss anybody, but it is. It's my favorite element. People and communities for eons have been living on water. They need water for fish, for other sources of food, for transportation, for power, for recreation, for beauty. So water is important to us, but a little bit too much of it can be difficult. So we want to talk a little bit about some of the flooding and the hydrogeology of the area and how that works in this area. So which way am I going? There we go. So first off, just to get everybody on the same page, I know some of you have been following this for a while, and some of you may be new to it. The important thing to remember about water is that it's always moving. It cycles through the earth, through the ground, through the air, through the clouds, through the plants, through the people, through the sewage plant. The most important thing that when I talk about water that I like to check and make sure everybody understands is which way does water flow? And it's a trick question, so if I asked you which way does water flow in Salem, what would you tell me? What?
Downhill.
Downhill. Water flows downhill. And understanding that basic thing is a lot about the understanding of what is a watershed and what's groundwater and what's surface water. So here's the hydrologic cycle. I'm going to check out the new, wow, that's really cool. So we can say that water starts up here in the clouds. It's not even going to talk about how it gets there. That's a whole other story. But let's just say we're starting from there, and water rains on the ground. And when it gets to the ground, it has a whole bunch of options. Depending on the slope and what kind of surface that is, it can run over that surface, or it can infiltrate into the ground. If it infiltrates into the ground, it'll hit those areas of soil that are dry, and infiltrate through. It might be bedrock, it might be soil, and eventually that water keeps going downhill, underground. It'll hit that area that's saturated, that we call the water table. And that water table level changes in every area depending on the weather, the climate, and what's been going on. Groundwater also flows downhill, and we're going to assume that this hill is a lot bigger than it is on the picture screen here. So that groundwater will flow downhill until it meets this area down here, where there's a channel of the river, or the stream, or the creek, or whatever you want to call it. And that groundwater table intersects that creek bed, and groundwater will feed into that creek bed. And then the water continues to flow downhill as it goes. Now, if that water hits the surface of the land, it depends on what's the soil, how fast it will infiltrate, if there's pavement, if there's bedrock, if there's a steeper grade, more of it will run off and directly downhill into the forested area, into the flatter area, until it also hits the stream, and the stream goes downhill to the ocean. Otherwise, trees can transpire the water that they pull up, vegetation can transpire the water that it pulls up, and it goes back into the atmosphere, or it winds its way all the way down into the ocean, where it also evaporates and heads up back here. Now, people pull that water out for their drinking use and for other uses, and that, as part of a wastewater treatment plant or a septic field, that also rejoins the cycle. Let's see. Okay, so here we're looking at watersheds. Watersheds are what people talk about when they talk about how water flows across the earth. Again, water flows downhill. So the part to remember about that watershed is it's that land area where when water falls on that land area, it all joins to a common point. So all of this rain that's falling on here is hitting that top peak of the mountain, and water on this side of the hill flows down this way, and water on this side of the peak flows down that way, and all that water that flows into that, whoops, did I do that? Sorry. All of that water that flows into these common tributaries that gather together and flow to that common point, that defines the watershed. Did I do it? I don't want to mess this up. Okay. Watersheds can be talked about on large regional scales, like you have the Hudson River watershed, comes all the way from here in upstate New York and farther up. The Mohawk River joins it, and it all flows down into the Atlantic Ocean in New York City. That's could be talked about as one watershed. It's one land mass where all the water flows over it out to the common point in the Atlantic Ocean. But mostly we talk about smaller watersheds, and we break those up into sub-watersheds. Whoops, sorry. And here we are over here in Salem. This is the Upper Hudson River watershed, which is this yellow part up here, broken up into its tinier sub-watersheds. So that just makes it easier to talk about when you break them up into smaller areas, but you can always talk about more than one sub-watershed as a larger watershed. Okay, communities and water. Like we were talking earlier, people live near water. That's just where we put most of our communities. The geology, the soils, the land cover, it's all going to be part of determining how that water flows over the surface of the earth. If you've got forest, the water is going to trickle through the trees, and some of that water gets transpired up back into the atmosphere. It makes it down to the soil. The tree roots keep the soil in place, the water infiltrates. It takes a long time to do that. If you have buildings and pavements in a city, that water that's falling down in rain can't infiltrate into the ground. The pavement's harder, most of it flows fast off of that pavement, off of that hard surface, into the nearest waterways. And those kinds of things can change the amount of flooding we see. If you have things in a human environment or bedrock in a natural environment that impede the way that rainwater infiltrates into the ground, you can increase the runoff, which will increase the amount that stream carries and increase your flooding. So natural floodplains, we're going to try to talk a little bit about two different pieces of vocabulary systems here. What I've been talking about is the natural systems. The natural floodplain is that area that's expected to flood, that stream bed. Maybe I should go back on that one. Sorry. Okay, so this stream water. Okay, the stream bed is here. The bank is this area on the side. When that stream gets full of floodwater after a storm, after snow melts, the water will go over that bank and spread out into this area that's the floodplain, that flatter area on the side of the river that the river can access. And that size of that floodplain is going to be different depending on how much flow is there, what material is in that river. Is it sand, is it rock, what types of things like that, and what's the slope of that plain around the stream. So that's all different, it's all locally specific. Here we go. So natural floodplains are just those areas that are expected to flood. We love water, we know too much of it, it's powerful. It can affect the landscape, it can affect the things that we build too close to the streams, things like that. So we're really interested in knowing where is it expected to flood, how often, how deep, how fast, how powerful is that going to be, and what does that mean about our risk? And that's when we get into some of the regulatory bit. Oh, not yet, sorry. Sources of flooding are often different depending on where you live. The ocean causes storm surge floods that affect the communities there. Rivers and streams. And you've seen rain. You can have a smaller rainstorm that just trickles down and gathers into the ground. Or you can have a hurricane or a larger storm that puts down more water than the soil can take in, and moisture that flows off and flows into the rivers, and they flow faster. You can even have conditions where the ground is frozen in the winter, maybe in February or March, where the weather's starting to get warmer, the snow starts to melt, you have a rain on snow event, but that ground is frozen and can't accept the water into it, so it floods, it runs off the surface of the ground and hits that stream bank and goes a lot faster. And all of these things can happen in a flood. So now here's the regulatory part. A floodplain is that part that can flood, no matter where it is. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, back in the early 80s, started setting up a system of national flood insurance program because there were lots of major floods and storms and dam breaks and things in which people and property were being injured, and how to make some sort of insurance program for that. They chose what's called the 1% chance annual flood. They determine that by studies. They look at flow records from stream gauges. This stream, on a regular basis, it flows this high, and when it flows that high, it's moving this much water. So if that water goes over the bank of the floodplain, if they look at the statistical records of those pieces, 1% chance in any 1 year is what we think of as a 100-year flood, which is kind of a misnomer. Your 1% chance every year can be the same 1% chance the next year, and the same 1% chance the next year, so you can have a 100-year flood in 2 years in a row, or 2 in 5 years. It's just the statistics of the thing. So the regulatory floodway for FEMA is that area on the river that you need to keep free of obstruction. You don't want to fill that, you don't want to change the land surface, you don't want to build a big building there that might dam up that major water. Those areas are mapped on the flood insurance rate maps in some places. On the older maps, they had a flood boundary area map and a floodway map. Then after 1986, they moved up to more of the firm maps that we're seeing now. So what they're mapping on those is that 1% annual chance for the risk to your property and human life. That's the risk level that they chose to focus on. If you focused on smaller storms than that, you might be making regulations about building things that were too strict and weren't really protecting people. If you went for a larger storm, it might be too large and these other storms would be causing damage. So they settled with the 1% chance annual flood. The regulatory floodplain, special hazard the special flood hazard area is that area that, in which that 1% annual flood on any particular river will cover. So the rest of the area out here can still be floodplain, but the FEMA regulatory floodplain is this area that gets covered by that 1% chance annual flood. Some maps have floodways that are often in the narrower river channel, and the special flood area hazards on the outside. So this is the effective firm map, sorry it doesn't show up so well, for the village of Salem. The town of Salem had a separate map. This is just the second panel on the south side. There's two separate panels here. And it's kind of hard to work with. Whoops, wrong way. I'm not very good at this. So here you have, you can see that it's kind of hard to show up there. This is the White Creek. And this is what's called a Zone A. It's this gray area is the area in which is going to be flooded by the 1% chance annual flood. The one that FEMA and the National Flood Insurance Program are interested in making regulations to protect to that level. There is no base flood elevation here. The studies done back in this map in the early 80s on this area did not put the base flood elevation. So if that river, if White Creek floods at a 1% chance annual storm, how high is that water going to come to above mean sea level? You don't have that information here on this old map. They're kind of difficult to work with. They're only paper. If you wanted to see where your property was and you wanted to determine if your property was in a flood, the FEMA floodplain, this is a little hard to work with. It also shows some areas where there might be railroads and things crossing, but it's not really detailed. Anyway, so some of you might have gone to the risk map update project meetings. Did anybody go to any of that? Good, yeah. What did I do? Where did you do that? Yeah. There we go. This is the draft study of this watershed, the White Creek watershed, that's being worked with now. This was presented in November of 2019. FEMA is updating the flood risk maps for the 4 counties in this area. Lots of places around the nation are being updated. You can really use the data from which they did those studies for the 1985 map is old. Things change, there's developments on the ground. The statistical data about how that water flows through the White Creek is going to be different because now there's more roads, now there's more railroad beds, now there's more bridges, things to change how the water moves across that floodplain. So these are going to be updated. The next step that I've heard is that there will be an update release into the community. I don't know how they advertise those. If you're already linked up, that's great. If I hear anything, ahead of time, I'll let you know. But yeah, you should pay attention to this coming up. It will be released for public comment in 2022, is what I heard. And I believe that's it.
Yay, flooding. So a couple of things that Tracy said that really are meaningful to me. You can have floodplain that FEMA is not saying is in a firm map. And that's one of the things we see in so many communities is that there are places you can go and you'll have a property owner say, it flooded here, I'm standing where it flooded. But then they'll say, but I'm not in a floodplain. And we'll say, well, you are. You're standing in a natural floodplain. The fact that it flooded means it's a floodplain. Now, FEMA is using a different metric. They're using a very specific instance to say, where's this boundary? And I can add a little bit to the story about where the FIRM program came from. Most of you know that I'm a land use planner. And so when we go to school, we have to study a lot of court cases. It's one of the things that we have to do because a lot of land use law comes out of court cases, not out of laws that were created by government. So there were many, many court cases back pre-1980s particularly if you go down to the Outer Banks area of this country. And there were folks who had massive houses built out of the sand dunes. If you've ever been down there, you know that it's just this, it's beautiful, but it's this really, really sandy, here's the sand, here's the ocean, there's no trees, there's no vegetation, there's nothing to keep that sand in place, or the houses, these multi-million-dollar houses that were built there. So, build a big house, 1988, 89, Hurricane Hugo comes, wipes out the houses. So these property owners go to their insurance company and say, give me my millions to rebuild my house. And they rebuild their house in exactly the same location, in the same place, with risk of flooding, with everything. So some of those people were covered by precursor to today's flood insurance, because regular insurance companies issued flood insurance. It wasn't done through the federal government. So they all went screamed and said, we're done. We're not doing this anymore because we're literally paying millions. And there's also obviously an environmental cost. There's a whole series of issues with this. So the federal government, in an attempt to sort of stop this and to address a whole host of lawsuits, came up with what is now the modern FIRM program, which limits the areas that are considered subject to flooding for federal flood insurance purposes. So it was in response to some of these things. In addition to that, many states and localities did adopt a lot of laws to say, we're no longer permitting you to build in these areas. And one of the things Tracy was talking about was the floodway. So the only thing you should see in a floodway is a bridge. Bridge abutments usually rest at the edge of floodways, because when you think about it, if you build a bridge and you have those big structures coming down, when the water comes, that either channels it or it makes it rise up and go around it. There's only two choices. The bridge is not moving in most cases. So, floodways should not be a place that we build anything. Floodplains, we also have to be really careful about what we put there. Because, putting a sidewalk there might be perfectly fine. Putting a house there, if the house is constructed properly so that it can withstand that flood, maybe. But we've all also seen on the news, and that seems to me like with increasing regularity, areas that are flooding. One of the things that was on one of Tracy's slides, if I can go back, was this. To me, this small street, this right here, nuisance and local drainage flooding and small street inadequate stormwater and drainage systems. We are seeing that over and over and over again in our communities. And that may be a factor here as well. Whatever storm drain system has been built may have been adequate in the past, but with, as Tracy said, with changes, it's not adequate anymore, so we are seeing flooding. So what's the relationship to sewers, right? We know we have a community here where we've been talking about sewers, I think, for a long time, certainly before I got here. Sewers have been discussed. You have a water system that I think is about 15 years old in that neighborhood, so that's a good thing. But you have a beautiful community with a dense pattern of urban development, which is lovely. Most of you know I come from a little village, and I love the whole little village and the character of that. But it does present some problems if we don't have public infrastructure. So right now, sewers in Salem, right? You have sewers. They're just septic systems on everybody's property. It's not like people aren't flushing toilets and taking showers. You have sewers. They're just on-lot private systems. So we'll talk a little bit for a second about those challenges. Secondly, what is community sewer system? What would it potentially look like here? Talk about kind of the different elements of that. And then our process. Where are we at in the process? And we have a long way to go, which is a good thing and a bad thing. And then that will segue lovely into Candace's discussion about income survey. So just for everybody's information, this picture over here, that lovely structure is called a trench box. This is an excavator that is creating a trench, and that, my friends, is a sewer pipe. That is a gravity sewer. This picture was taken in the town of Wyndham, probably about 10 years ago at this point. Our construction guys take great pictures of things like pipes, but not a lot of pictures of things that you can actually show people what they look like. But this is, kind of what constructing a sewer system can look like, just so everybody has an idea. So septic systems. Everyone here, if you own a property, you have some kind of on-site treatment system. We kind of pejoratively call them septic systems. We know that this is a very old community, so we suspect that a number of the septic systems aren't what we would consider sort of modern engineered systems, because they probably predate modern engineering. But if they were, this is more or less what a septic system looks like. We have our house, which all the plumbing goes to some point, usually in the basement. There's a wall penetration, it comes out to a septic tank. And the septic tank is usually, this is one's got a manhole and a couple of little ports on it, which is kind of a swank, fancy new septic tank. A lot of them don't have that. Usually there's a baffle wall someplace in here. As the water enters, solids are going to accumulate on one side of the baffle wall. The water fills up and comes over the top and out the pipe that's set at an elevation out to this little structure, which is called a distribution box, out to a leach field. There will be a series of pipes, a network of pipes that I described to people look like the time of a fork. They sort of all come together in one spot, and when they come out, they are generally perforated pipes. They're constructed in some kind of media, usually some little rocks. The bottom of the septic system is relying on this natural soil horizon to filter the water, the wastewater, as it travels through. And septic systems, you might not think about this, they're underneath the ground, but they are aerobic. There's bacteria in there. They're consuming oxygen, they're consuming the organic matter that's in the wastewater. As it travels through the septic system and through the ground, through the soil underneath it, before it hits the groundwater. Now, this picture, this is I'm not a huge fan of this because this makes it look like groundwater is some kind of underground lake. And it's not. And one of the things Tracy said earlier that's really important to understand about groundwater is it's simply the saturated zone of soils down below us, right? So the groundwater table is going to be different depending on your geology. So just the natural of what's here. One of the slides Tracy had in here that we decided maybe was a little too far was about glaciation. This area was subject to glaciation. So that geology is a result of the glaciers being here. The groundwater table is a result of that, but the groundwater table also fluctuates, it changes. It's going to be higher at some points in the year, like now, right? Because we've had snow melt, usually we have rainy springs, and then when you get all the way to, say, August, the groundwater table may be a little bit lower, right? So one of the questions I know that I've heard some folks say is, the White Creek at times in some locations appears to be dry. Where did the water go? So remember, Tracy had that picture where she was showing that the groundwater level, that saturated soil level actually intersects the creek. It is the base flow of the creek. Well, we just said that in the fall, in the late summer and fall, the groundwater level is lower. So it's still there. You're just not seeing it intersect the bottom of the creek. So one of the challenges here is that septic systems rely on a bunch of different things. They're pretty simple, and they do work. I have a septic system at home. You have to maintain them, but they can be challenging. One point is our septic tank over here, right? Those are sometimes metal, sometimes concrete, sometimes 55-gallon drums with holes in them. Kind of depends on where you are in the world. Sometimes I've seen, old propane tanks that people cut both ends off of, and that's my septic tank. You see a lot of different things, but that septic tank, we're relying on it being sound, on it not having the concrete, not having the crumble apart. It's questionable after a certain period of years or based on soil conditions and materials of construction. So we're relying on that as part of our treatment system. This distribution box needs to be perfectly level because somebody said earlier, Tracy asked the question, where does the water go here? Downhill. So that distribution box is literally working on water level. It needs to be level because if it's tipped even the slightest, remember I said a septic field laid out at times of a fork, one side will get more wastewater than the other simply because water goes downhill. So we are relying on that distribution box to be level. Now, what happens if this tree has tree roots that grows into this septic tank because it's searching for water? That can be a problem, right? That same thing can happen with our distribution box. Different things, you know, maybe Papa Joe came and set up a tent for little Susie's wedding and ran a big truck over the top of the distribution box. Happens all the time. Not so good. And then the other thing that we're talking about that we're relying on is we're relying on this zone of treatment right here, which either relies on natural material or it could be fill. You can bring in fill. But we're assuming that that zone of treatment still has the capacity to treat the wastewater that's being applied to it. After some period of time, these beds can need to be refreshed, they need to be rested, those kinds of things. And if you have one at your house and it's been used for 80 years, that could be an issue. And then the last thing we should talk about is this groundwater down here at the bottom. When that water table is high, which does happen in the spring under flooding conditions, those kinds of things, that treatment zone is flooded. So you're losing that value of treatment. So this is where septic systems in certain locations can be a challenge to creating really clean water and to really protecting the environment. So community sewer system, what's the difference? So no septics, right? So septic tanks are gone, leach fields are gone. In this case, we have a nice little house here. And this one's kind of cool because it shows us that this has a roof leader. So this has a gutter running along the roof. The roof leader's coming down. It's also picking up a floor drain here, and it's coming over and it's going into a storm sewer. So you can see there's a catch basin up on the street. It's going into a storm sewer. One of the things we don't want to do is go in and mix stormwater. And we're going to hold questions until the very end.
They're texting me saying that you need to tip the computer because they all they see is the railing.
Oh.
Say that again?
Tip the
Here,
computer.
hold it back.
The other way.
The other way. Here.
Oh, can't go?
All right, with it.
How's that? Better?
I don't know. I'll ask about it.
See if they can make it.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Oh, that little thing will go away. You got it?
Thanks.
Good. So this one we want to keep our stormwater separate from our sanitary. It's a good practice, and it's certainly required now in past days, not so much get all the water away. This shows you that we have, again, sewers all being collected in the house, coming to a pipe called a lateral. It's coming out and connecting into a sewer main, which is underneath the ground, that very first image that I showed, going to a sewer plant and then out to the stream. We'll talk about that in a sec. And this is a manhole that you would traditionally see out in the gravity sewer system. So those are kind of the big picture elements. Now there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Sewer systems can be done with pressure. So if you're not able to work with the gravity that God gave you, you can actually put in pump stations and force the water to go uphill. There's cost associated with doing that. Sometimes it's unavoidable. But generally speaking, try to work with gravity because it's there, it happens all the time, power's out, it still happens, those kinds of things. But these are the basic elements of a sewer system, community sewer system. Wastewater treatment. Here's my lovely picture of the White Creek. I did not take this picture. I swiped it from a friend who did take this picture. But this is a picture of the White Creek. I know there's been a lot of questions about, okay, so we're going to treat this wastewater and we're going to put it in the White Creek. And the White Creek is a really valuable resource to the community. So how are we going to make sure that we're protecting the White Creek? There's also been discussion about, well, when we have that condition where there's no water in the White Creek because the groundwater table is so low, what's going to happen then? Can you still discharge wastewater that's treated to it? What happens when it's flooding? How do we make sure that the wastewater that's being discharged from the wastewater treatment plant isn't exacerbating flooding, isn't making the condition worse? So a couple of things. The White Creek in this area is considered a Class C, capital T water body. So you might say, well, who's been out there classifying water bodies? Well, the state has. So the State of New York, actually the federal government and the state of New York classify water bodies based on highest and best use. So they go from drinking water sources, which are AAA, AA, and A. So those are some of our more pristine lakes and reservoirs, and there are a number of them here in the state. Those are considered drinking water sources. Now that doesn't mean that you should walk up to your cup and scoop out some water and drink it. There's still, viruses and things in there that can make you sick. But they are considered waters of the highest and best use as drinking water source. B class waters are those that are suitable for contact recreation, meaning swimming. C class waters are classified as those that the highest and best use is non-contact recreation, so that'll be like boating and fishing. And that's what the White Creek is classified as. And the capital T means that it supports trout. So there's another designation that's an S, TS, which would be that it supports fingerlings for spawning. This section of the White Creek, through the heart of the community, certainly is classified as supporting trout. There are other sections that have that S designation. Now, if somebody's going to no doubt say, hey, wait a minute, I see fingerlings in this. Maybe true, right? All good. This is just the classification system that the state has. So why do we care about the classification system? Because it has to do with what do we need to do to protect the water body so that it continues to maintain this function or a better function in terms of cleaning up the wastewater before we discharge it. So for a class CT water body, what are the primary things we're worried about? We're worried about water clarity. So we're worried to make sure that the water's clean, that when we look at it, it visually looks clean. That's really, really important. We're worried about the temperature. Trout like cold water. So we don't want super high temperatures if we can avoid them. We also don't want big swings in temperature if we can avoid it. And we're also worried about nutrients. So nutrients are a big concern. We will hear them. I know you hear about them a lot here in your community, your farming community. Nutrient management is a really, really important part of this. When we say nutrients, that's a fancy word that covers things that make stuff grow. So mostly phosphorus and nitrogen are the things that we're concerned about. In your case, it would be nitrogen and ammonia, which has a big component of nitrogen that is in wastewater. So we would want to make sure that we clean all of that up. So sewage treatment plants are regulated so that the treatment that's required will ensure that the discharge into the water body isn't going to degrade the water quality so that it no longer supports aquatic life, so that maybe there's a temperature issue with fish, those kinds of things. So in this case, the treatment plant would be designed to ensure that we meet that water quality standard. So what do wastewater treatment plants look like? I think a lot of us maybe picture sort of industrial style facilities, maybe some tanks and things outside. They can look like that. Some of them do. A lot of them also look like this building right here. So this is a 50,000 gallon a day wastewater treatment plant in New York City's drinking watershed. It sits in the middle of a multi-million-dollar housing development. And we had to put a sign on it that says, "Not the tennis club." This made a lot of people come in and wanting to know if this was where they signed up for tennis. So as a result, you can tell it does not smell, it does not make noise, because if it did, they wouldn't be coming here and asking if they could play tennis. This wastewater treatment plant here in Salem, we do some planning. We're looking at somewhere in this range, maybe 50,000 gallons a day, maybe 75,000 gallons a day, if we consider some growth. So I know it's hard to kind of see how big that building is, but you can tell it's not enormous. It's also not particularly ugly. It's kind of an innocuous building. That was built in 2014. That particular facility does not discharge to a stream. Instead, there's a very large irrigation system that it discharges to. So that system is discharging treated water, is basically drinking water, sewage turned into drinking water, directly to the groundwater table. And that was a requirement because it's in New York City's drinking watershed. So that's an interesting project. The pictures up here This is inside the building. These underneath here, there's grading, and underneath here is a series of equipment and things, and this is just piping that's moving water from point A to point B. And down at the bottom here, this is different chemicals and different components, but I just kind of wanted to show you that wastewater treatment plant, I think we can, it's easy to conceptualize them as being these industrial, dirty, ugly, smelly, noisy, lit, terrible things. They don't have to be, and a lot of them aren't. This wastewater treatment plant, when you go there, when you walk inside, you feel like you're sort of in a laboratory. That's kind of the sensation that you get. A lot of them are designed this way, modern system. So the discharge, this is another thing I know people are very worried about. I think most people think about a sewer plant discharge and they're picturing this, right? And that picture, that's an image of, actually, black pipe is discharge from a construction site. The other pipe is stormwater discharge. This picture was taken in northern New Jersey. Unfortunately, not all that long ago. This site was fined for doing this. I did not take the picture. Someone sent it to me. That is not what proper discharges look like. Big issues with discharges, right, would be erosion. Discharging all of that water in the top image so quickly out into the creek or river is going to cause all kinds of erosion. No fish or anything can live there. There's no habitat that's going to make it through that. That is not a good practice. It is not a standard practice. That is not something that would be permitted, and it certainly wouldn't be something that we would do. So I know that that's kind of something people kind of envision, and that's just not what we have. Instead, what we have is down here on the bottom. This structure is a concrete head wall. And unfortunately, I couldn't get too far, much further down. I took this picture during construction because I would have been in water. But inside that concrete head wall is the pipe that is the discharge from the treatment plant. The other thing that you see is that there's all this rock here. That's intentional. That's riprap. And the riprap's there for a couple of reasons. This picture was taken in the relative dry. This picture in October. That's when this work was done. This is probably 10 years ago now. I wanted to get a picture of this today because it's all grown in and green and really pretty and you can't even see the head wall, but I couldn't get down there because it's so grown in and green that I couldn't get down there. This is intentional because that the rocks allow the water to spread out. It gets aerated. There's no erosion. It's not coming out in that chute like we were seeing in that other picture. This is a more typical design for an outfall. This is a design that's in consideration. This is a trout stream. This is actually a spawning stream. This is the Schoharie Creek. So it's designed for a variety of different purposes. Now, what do we do about that whole idea of, okay, the river is flooded, where does the water go? Well, the water still goes into the river. The way treatment plants work is, if you think about it, when you're at your house and you get up in the morning, you take showers, you have breakfast, whatever, you use a lot of water. Then, even if you're home, probably from the period after that until lunchtime, you probably don't use all that much water. Lunchtime, you might use a little more water. Afternoon, you probably won't use a lot of water. In the evening, dinner time, you use some more water. At nighttime, you have to do nothing. Well, treatment plants, that's called a diurnal flow. Treatment plants are designed to take that flow of water, which does go up and down, it's being delivered through all those pipes in the collection system, get to the treatment plant, and then the flow is equalized. It's captured and spread out over treatment over a long course of time. The water that enters the treatment plant right now at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, if you have a standard conventional wastewater treatment plant, it's going to hang around inside that treatment plant for 3 or 4 days before it gets out the other side, because that's the time it takes to get through the treatment process. So it is not the rushing wall of water comes in and then gets passed out through. It's not how a treatment plant works. So that being the case, one of the things I wanted to point out was that 75,000 gallons a day is 52 gallons a minute. I think you all kind of understand that a little bit better. 75,000 gallons sounds like a lot. 52 gallons a minute sounds a little more reasonable. It does equalize the flow and discharge it slowly over a long period of time. And it can be designed to discharge over really any course of time that's necessary. There are rare cases where high water would cause treatment plant not to discharge. They're designed so that they continue to discharge. And if you think about it, that's an important thing, because even if there's a flood going on, people are still in their homes, people are still using the sewer system. We can't have everything stop. So they continue. When the stream level is very, very low, they continue to discharge. The water quality is such that it is the same or better than what is in the water body. So it is not taking raw sewage and putting it into the stream. That water is very clean and treated. So I think that was my last point on that one. I kind of got. So the outfall design prevents erosion. So my last point, and then I'm going to turn over to Candace, is that developing a community system, sewer system is a process. I know that the engineering report has been prepared here a while ago. We looked at that. There's some changes that we need to make just to kind of catch it up to modern time. One thing that's unfortunate is costs are escalating rapidly. They have escalated over the last couple of years, probably on the order of about 15% since 2018, which is unfortunate because that's a lot of money. We do seem to see, we have some bids coming back now that seem to be indicating that things are leveling out a bit, which would be good to have some stability in construction markets. But a big part of this, the engineering side, the pipes and the treatment plant and getting the permits and making sure that the creek is protected, that's all important and absolutely needs to be done. But really what has to be done is the community has to decide this is something that it wants to do. And if not this, then what are you going to do to protect your community, to encourage the investment that you need to continue the quality of life that you have? You need sort of a plan B. And more importantly, if this is something that the community decides you want to do, you have to figure out how you're going to pay for it. It is really unfortunate, but the way that it works here in New York State is there's no one to pay for this except for the users. The folks who are benefited by the system pay for it. So if you live in the town, you live not in the farmer village and not in the water district, and you're out kind of in the countryside, this project could benefit you indirectly by creating more economic activity that gives you a better tax base, but you are not going to pay for it. The only people who pay for the sewer, pay for the debt service to build it, pay to operate and maintain it, pay for the permits, are the people who would be in the district that would be created, that would be using the system, and that would benefit from the system. So it's expensive. So where are we right now? We have a preliminary plan. We have some preliminary costs, so we have an idea of order of magnitude of where to go, but we have to figure out finances. People will say, okay, what about grants? Well, there are some grants, and Salem can certainly, there are some grants that Salem qualified for. Right now, I'm sitting here today without doing anything else. One of those grants is called a Water Infrastructure Improvement Grant. It's up to 25% or $5 million of the cost of a project. That's a big deal. That sounds like a very big deal. But I will say that to get a project done here in this community and keep the costs, no one's going to like them, but keep the costs as low as possible, you will need more support than that. There's something called the Northern Border Commission that Salem could certainly work with. That could potentially be up to maybe around $500,000 in grant funding. That's another great source. There are others as well. But really, when we look at where's low-cost financing, where do grants come from? They come from two sources. One is having a substantial environmental need. And there are communities that have existing infrastructure that is in very, very poor condition that we can point to and say, this treatment plant does not discharge water that is protected with the water body. That's a big problem. So there's a lot of focus on grants and money to those communities. You're not in that position. It's a good thing. It's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, meaning that avenue towards grant funding isn't open to you. Another one, and this is where Candace, I'm going to stop talking, Candace is going to pick up here, is need-based grants, which are those where it's never free, but where there's an evaluation done based on the ability of the community to pay for something and how burdensome a project is to the community. So that's where Candace comes in and can talk a little bit about income survey, those kinds of things. The rest of the process, before I give over the little magic wand to Candace, sewer district needs to be formed. I know that a lot of folks here will remember when the water district formed, same process, public hearing, those kinds of things. Implementation, I put a little schedule up here. It's a long process. Just really quickly, design and permitting, I put 18 months. Could potentially be quicker. This is, if we do a sewer system, we're going to be on everybody's property doing those little connections to houses. That is a very detailed, time-consuming process. So it takes some time. Public bidding is usually about 3 months. This would be obviously a public project, subject to prevailing wages, bidding laws, those kinds of things. Construction, I put 18 to 24 months. That's pretty generous. Hopefully it could be on the 18-month side. But again, this is a pretty involved project. You would probably have a contractor building a treatment plant. You would probably have a contractor out doing the collection system, working at the same time. And again, you know, it's a big project for the community. And go back and remember that very first slide that I showed. That would be happening kind of everywhere. And then the last thing would be, you know, once it's done, we have to make sure that it works. So there's a process that's gone through to make sure that the system that's prepared works. So I'm going to hand this over to Candace.
Hi, I'm Candace Ballmer, and I'm the state lead for New York with a not-for-profit called OurCAP Solutions. And OurCAP Solutions is a national, it's a regional, one of 6 regional partners in a national network, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership. And you can see that OurCAP Solutions up in purple there, that's the region that we cover. So the Northeast states, and we also cover Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We're federally funded to assist small, poor, rural communities at usually, almost always, at no cost to them, to assist them to implement water and wastewater improvements. That's essentially what we're funded by the federal government to do. We have technical assistance providers like me in every state and territory in the nation. Some of those states and territories also get private money from the state, or not private money, but they get state money to help with this technical assistance, but New York does not. So we're exclusively federally funded to provide technical assistance and training to small rural communities like Salem. So I was brought in by Mary Beth to help with the income survey. And as Mary Beth pointed out, the purpose of the income survey is to help you document your eligibility for funding. So what I wanted to do is just give a quick recap of the survey and then tell you where we're at in terms of survey responses that have been received so far, what the results of that are, and what else you need to do to button this up, because there's still a bit of work to be done. So why do the survey? Well, the town is obviously looking for additional funding to help keep the cost of this proposed project down. And so to do that, they need to document that they're eligible for these funding programs. And several of the biggest infrastructure funding organizations I'll talk about in a minute require income surveys to prove that the community is eligible for this assistance. So who are we surveying? We're surveying all the residential households in the proposed area. The district, that's the boundaries of the proposed area, so it's not everybody in the town of Salem, just this proposed district. And it's only the residential houses, but that would, not houses, residential units. So that would be an apartment, either side of a duplex, a single family home, whatever. Each of those is a household. It's a distinct household. I had some people write back and said, well, why isn't the sewer system benefiting the commercial people? It's definitely benefiting the commercial people. Those boundaries are drawn to serve a physical area and everything that's in there. But for purposes of an income survey, we're documenting the income, the collective income of this area of the residents. And when I talk about apartments, we're surveying the people that live in the apartments, not the people that own them. Because these programs exist to help the people that live in the community. So if you own property but didn't get a survey, it's because we know you don't live in the proposed district. You own property, but either that's a rental unit or it's a commercial property. But that doesn't mean that your unit wouldn't be served. It just means it's not a residential unit. So again, we're documenting area-wide eligibility. All this income data comes back, and I'm actually tasked with receiving your surveys, processing them, which means entering them into a specific for that purpose database created by OurCAP, and spitting out some numbers at the end, collective data. So nobody's really interested in your individual income at all. It's how does that relate to a broader picture of what the service area is? How financially needy is the service area? So in this proposed service area right now, these are not hard numbers. We find houses sometimes they're vacant. This is actually my 355 households is occupied households. Sometimes somebody goes and buys a property while we're doing the survey, things are transferred, the records aren't up to date. There's tweaking that goes on, so don't hold me to this exact number, but this is what it is right now. This is what I'm giving you right now. Right now, in the proposed sewer district area, there's 355 occupied households, which doesn't mean only single-family homes again. That includes one apartment as one household, right? So about 280 or 3/4 of that are owner-occupied units, and the other quarter are rental-occupied units, which is a point of interest. It's not necessarily significant. So far, we've received 123 completed surveys. And when I say completed surveys, it means you told me what your address is and how much money you make. Because if you don't tell me your income, it doesn't count. So I've actually received more than 123 surveys, but I've received 123 completed surveys. That translates into a percent return of 35%. So a little over a third of the people, their households in the service area have returned a survey, completed survey so far. What does that mean? Well, you're looking at more than one funder. There's different funding agencies. Mary Beth mentioned the Water Improvement Grant Program administered basically through the State Revolving Loan Fund. The State Revolving Loan Fund itself, which is called the SRF, USDA, which is actually the longest infrastructure funder for small rural communities of any of these. They've been doing this for over 100 years. And they're now known as USDA Rural Development, but we'll call them USDA. And finally, the Community Development Block Grant, which you may have heard of, which helps with housing, as well as infrastructure issues like water and wastewater. So, they're all different agencies. They're federal and state agencies. They do not use the same criteria as each other. Each of them has different criteria. How does that impact the survey? Well, State Revolving Fund and USDA want you to get at least 50% of the surveys completed to be considered you've gotten enough. The CDBG program says, well, you need 60% of your 355 surveys back. So how does that translate? USDA and SRF, they want to see 178 surveys total. You've got 123. You need 55 more surveys to meet their return rate. CDBG program, they want 213 surveys back. You need another 90 surveys to meet their requirements. So you need a few more, right? You need 35 more surveys than the other program. Whether or not you're going to need to do that kind of depends on how this proceeds, and I'll tell you why. So in summary, you have 355 households. You've got a 35% return so far, or 123 surveys. The median household income is $50,000. SRF and USDA look at the median household income when they're determining eligibility. What is the median household income? If I take all your survey data and sort them by income from lowest to highest, it's the one in the middle. So you could have somebody making $1 billion. It's only a placeholder for the highest, probably the highest income in the whole town. But still, that income in the middle is still going to be the same, whether that biggest one is $1 million or 500,000 or $1 billion. So it's not an average. It's the median. So 50,000 confers eligibility for some pretty good terms for both of them. And I'm not going to bore you with those particular details right now. I don't think you need to know that, but we can talk about it if there's interest. But I wanted to point out that the Community Development Block Grant uses a different metric. They use percent low to moderate income individuals. So they're not counting households, they're counting individuals, which is why when you get your survey, it says how many people live in the house. And really, I need to know that too. I said I only needed the income and your address, but I really need to know how many people live there too, to get this other metric. And the way that they determine that is based on county data, and you may have heard of county housing and urban development thresholds. And those are based on, for one person, I completely forgot to bring my Washington County list. I could have told you what it is. But at any rate, for one person, let's say it's 30,000. For two people, it's 35,000. For three people, it's 42,000, et cetera, up to 8 people. So when I crank all this stuff in the database, it spits out, it counts all those for me. Good thing. And the number of individuals in each house, like say you've got a 4-person house at 20,000. Okay, that's well below, that's considered low to moderate income. So I now have 4 people, low to moderate income, in one house. So as you can see, it's a little different from that median household income. To even qualify to apply for this Community Development Block Grant, which is 100% grant. It's the only program, well, it's not the only program, but it's 100% grant. Most of them have a loan component as well. Right now, it's probably about $900,000 for a project. It might go up in this next round. Probably by the time you apply for it, it'll probably be closer to $1.2 million, I'm imagining, would be the maximum grant you could get under this program. But you can't even apply unless you have more than half your people are considered low to moderate income. More than half the people is 52% basically, or more low to moderate income people, individuals. You are right now at 46.39%. It's not close to 52, but it's a lot closer than some. It's hard to tell what's going to happen with those 50 to 90 surveys that you're going to collect. In fact, you're going to need another 90 to even say to the Community Development Block Grant, we finished the survey. So if you had 90 more surveys, you may or may not trip that 52%, I don't know. The other 2 programs are more of a sliding scale with that median household income, so it's not an either or. 50,000 is good. You'd be eligible for a little more money right now if it was under 46,000. But that could change too. These metrics change for different reasons. So there's a decennial census data, the 2020 data is going to be coming out. USDA is going to start using some different numbers. 50,000 may qualify you for their best terms, but we don't know that yet. There's some things that are happening right now because of it's 2021, this decennial survey changes, the SRF uses different years, so does the CDBG program. But anyway, our survey collects the data needed to document eligibility under all three of these programs. So, you don't know yet where you stand because you have further to go to collect these surveys. And odds are you're probably going to want to get those 90 surveys to see if you qualify for that $1.2 million grant, as well as these other programs, which are grant and loan mixes. But it's always nice to have that $1 million plus in there as well. So it's really important to finish the survey. Surveys, when you say, if you look online and say, what's a typical return rate for residential surveys? And it'll say 25 to 50% on a mail out. And man, I see routinely 33% of the people respond to a mail out. It might take a couple of mailings to get to that 33%, but it's a long way from your 60%, right? So how do we get those surveys? Usually, we go door to door and knock and ask people at the door to fill out the survey, or we survey them right there and collect those surveys. Well, we were just getting ready for that basically when COVID hit. The Wastewater Committee has done a phenomenal job of reaching out to people without actually knocking on their doors. But as you can see, they have worked very hard in this past year. And we still have a lot more surveys to get. And ultimately, it may come down to going out and knocking door to door. Once people are vaccinated, there's less fear of going interpersonally. Some communities, I have one that said, we're going. And they went out with their masks and they stood at the door and they didn't keep the door shut, put on your mask, I'm going to ask you some questions, is that okay? Filled it out. Do you mind if I sign on your behalf? Hold up the survey, this is what I just filled out for you. Okay. And they got a tremendous number of surveys. However, they are braver than me. I sometimes go out and help communities get these surveys through door-to-door canvassing. But I'm not allowed to. My agency is not letting me go do that for obvious reasons, and hopefully this will all ease up. So what I'm telling you is this is not easy, but you've come incredibly far under extremely difficult circumstances, and that's a really good news for your community because as Mary Beth pointed out, you've got a ways to go to even get to where you're formed your district, where you've got a majority of people voting to form a district. That's going to go to referendum, presumably. And it's going to go to a vote. So you're educating people, you're taking your time, you're doing your homework, you're looking for the money, you're doing the best that you can in difficult circumstances to move this project forward and ultimately determine whether you have the support of the public to move forward. So congratulations, pat yourselves on the back. And if you are out and about, and particularly if you know any renters, because we don't have the names of the renters. Again, the Wastewater Committee's done an incredible outreach to try to get the names and addresses of the renters. Some of them get mail at the post office, but when you get mail that says to occupant or to water user, because everybody in the service area is on water as well, dear water user or dear occupant or whatever, into the garbage, that's one I don't have to worry about. So if we have a name, at least we got a name and an address. So if you know any renters that haven't filled out the survey and would be willing to participate and share their name and address, the committee can mail them a survey. There's even an online thing where you can use your smartphone and use that QR code. Boom, pops the survey right up. You can fill it right out on your smartphone. Done. Goes to me. I added in. So we've gotten probably 10 people who have returned surveys electronically. But we could really use your help getting the word out that this data stays with me. The town gets summary data like you see right here. Ultimately, the funding agencies, one of them asked for a list of surveys in income order, not attached to any homes. They're just going to see 200 incomes in a row in order so they can pick out that one in the middle. But your information doesn't get sent out. It doesn't go off my computer. I'm really nervous about hacking and this, that, and the other thing, so I am careful about that to the extent that I can be. But this information, while it's not anonymous, it is confidential, and I take that very seriously. So, help spread the word. Thanks so much.
Questions? Yeah.
So if we don't get enough surveys returned, we are not eligible for those grant programs.
For those 3 that I mentioned, yes, correct.
Those are, most of these grant programs are trying to target this money towards people who really need it. So most of them have some kind of a component that is looking at need. So these surveys are really important. And as Candace said, we're in a little bit of a period of flux. The SRF program is using the 2017 American Community Survey data. That will change when the census data comes out at some point. They do refresh and update this information, but your income survey is good for 2 years?
No, your income survey data is going to be the freshest data and won't expire for several years.
Okay. And that, it is really the best metric. The stuff that we see in the census is, I don't know how many people here answered the census, but I know at my house, I wasn't asked to provide my income. I actually asked a whole bunch of people, nobody I know was asked to provide their income, because they only get a small smattering of people, and then they do some math to say this represents a community. So this is truly the best way to get a reflection of the community. And we do want to see that you can qualify for as many grants as you possibly can.
It's also true that your town is the census area that they look at generally. They're looking at the town. But this service area is a subset of the town. And I think a lot of your rentals, who are traditionally probably lower income than homeowners, are probably in the center, in the hamlet center. So that's the other reason why the census data is really inaccurate for a town. Villages it's way more accurate because that is the boundary, and it's often the service area boundary as well. But towns, usually it's the commercial hamlet. So the survey is almost always lower income than the town as well.
Yeah.
Are there any case studies for communities similar size and economic situation as Salem who have installed a system and what the economic benefits are?
Yeah, so we can talk about kind of the ones that we've been involved in. So my company's been around for a little over 30 years. All we do is public water and sewer systems. We do public buildings. We just do municipal work. We've seen a number of communities where there was no sewer, then there was sewer, and then we can look at, we can look and say, okay, so assessed values went up. We can look and say there were more building permit applications. We can look at a bunch of things like that. The one thing I always caution people about is the sewer system wasn't the only thing that happened in these communities. It never happens in a vacuum. Oftentimes, when there is such a major public investment, we're talking about a lot of money. Money breeds money. It also attracts other investment, and other things are happening. I had showed you some pictures from Windham, which is down in Greene County. If you're a skier, you may have gone there to go skiing, or it's in the Catskills. It's great hiking. Their system, they had septic systems. The mountain had its own sewer system. New York City came in because they were New York City's drinking watershed and said, no more septic systems. So New York City gave them money to install a full sewer system. Would not be nice if someone showed up and gave you a block grant to do that. Very rare occasion. But so they went from nothing to a full-scale system, state-of-the-art, that had capacity for growth. And at the same time, because that was happening, a number of local property owners decided to make investments because it was happening. The mountain made investments because it was happening. So we can't just point to the sewer system and say this is the reason these things happened, but it certainly did spur that, and we can certainly provide some of that information. I'm always a little reluctant just because these kinds of investments never happen in a vacuum. There's always other things going on, as we pointed out, that timeline gives people a long lead up to make decisions about spending money or buying property or investing. But, we do have some case studies. I think on the other flip side, we have a lot of case studies where we can show where a lack of public infrastructure has inhibited investment and has actually led to disinvestment. Because I know right here we have trouble with restaurants because of not having adequate septic systems, and the Department of Health comes and says, this isn't going to work, what do we do? We have actually more case studies on that side than we do on the, on the side of, we kind of like statistics. So it's hard to sort of say, this increase in assessed value was because we put in a sewer system, but we can say a whole series of things happened and assessed value went up. Or we can go to communities and say, these folks have no infrastructure and they are not seeing any investment, and they are seeing a shrinking tax base, and they're struggling economically. So we got both sides of that coin.
Mary Beth, let me jump in, because there's just something I wanted to add to that, because it's so important because of COVID. So many restaurants have gone out of business. Once your restaurant's out of business for a while, it triggers a new health department review. And all of a sudden, they want all kinds of upgrades to your septic system. It's inadequate. It was fine as long as you were grandfathered in or operating continuously, but as soon as it's done, I think it's 12 months, I'm not sure how long the period is.
Yeah.
It triggers that review, and it's caused incredible heartache for communities wrestling with this issue throughout the state.
That is a really good point. Yeah, that discontinuation of use. So if you continue the use, even if, I owned the restaurant and I sold it to Candace and she just kept the restaurant and kept going and we went on for 50 years, you just get to keep going. But if I close the restaurant and Tracy buys it 2 years later, she now is starting all over again. It's like it was never a restaurant. And that is, Candace, that's a really, really good point. That's a real challenge. And it's going to be a challenge even here pre-COVID, there were restaurants that closed that are going to have a tough time coming back in and saying, well, yeah, but it was a restaurant 2 years ago and it was fine for them. Well, you got to play by all the new rules. So that is definitely an issue. And we talk about restaurants in case anybody's wondering, why are we picking on restaurants, right? Restaurants, because, first of all, they're regulated by the Department of Health. Unlike maybe your house or some other uses, if you have a little commercial store, if you have a little restaurant or a little retail shop, you're not regulated by the Department of Health. You're not providing anyone with food. There's a higher standard that restaurants are held to. The other thing is about restaurants, as you think about it, is we have, fats, oils, and greases from cooking. There's a lot of, sort of waste involved, those kinds of things. So the standards that they're held to are higher. So it's not, a restaurant septic system is not your typical septic system at your house. It will have a separate grease trap. It will be built to a more robust standard if it meets current standards. And that's one of the problems with old uses. They didn't necessarily have to follow all those rules. To Candace's point, it's a good one. If it's discontinued, you now have to follow the new rules. If you didn't have a grease trap before, now you need to have one. Where on your little postage stamp are you going to put one? A grease trap is a concrete tank in the ground. Takes up real estate. You can't put parking over the top of it. You can't, so it's a challenge. Sure?
When it's time to do the vote, is it just the people in the district voting?
Yes, so for forming a sewer district, in New York State town law, there's two ways a sewer district gets formed. One is that the town board comes together and says, done all this research, and we have all these reports and studies, and here's a plan. And, we want to see, there's two ways it happens. The town board could say, okay, we think this should happen, and the town board could vote on it. The second part of that is that then those who are in the district, so if you live out in the hinterlands, this is not you, the people who are going to pay for it will vote to say, we support that decision, that this is in the public's interest, or they will vote to say, we do not support that decision, that this is in the public's interest. And at the end of the day, having done a lot of these systems, generally speaking, we do a lot of work to try, like we did here. It's fact-based work. It's based on conditions on the ground. In my experience, most people at the end of one of these processes will agree that a sewer system is probably needed. Maybe they have different reasons for saying that, but they will agree the sewer system could benefit the community. It always comes down to cost. It always comes down to what's the price tag. And then in terms of the price tag, You know, the way that this is done is the users pay the cost. The cost usually has a couple of components to it. There's paying back the debt. There's almost always borrowing with these systems. So it's just like your mortgage, borrow the money to buy the house, you have to pay the bank back. It's the same kind of thing. There's debt. There's the cost of operating and maintaining the system, which is literally, you know, there will be power costs. There will be people who will run the system. There will be the cost of chemicals. There will be other costs associated with it. And then there's sort of administrative costs, right? Someone has to send out the bills and do all of those kinds of things. Those costs are paid for by the users. Generally speaking, on an annual basis, it could be a quarterly bill or whatever, but the budget is done annually, so there's a cost. One of the things that we always try to suggest to people is, I will have people say, but my septic system is free to me. And I go, well, yes, it is, right up until you need to do something with it. And then you call a local septic contractor and they show up. And I know at this point, the Washington County Department of Health is requiring that, you know, when you repair a septic system, you hire an engineer and that engineer provides stamped plans that show that your septic system, your new or repaired septic system meets the code. That, my understanding is that cost is about $3,000 just for the engineer. You haven't built anything yet. You haven't dug a hole. $3,000. Then there's the cost of actually doing that. So I always say to people, you have to think about your septic system's free right up until you need to do something with it. And then, so there's the practical, just you'll have to do something. With the sewer system, it's an annual cost. As I said, it kind of creeps up on you. It takes years to do this. Hopefully it's something folks can plan for and budget if it happens, because it does not happen overnight. No one should be surprised. But when your septic system goes, it often is a surprise. And the septic contractor is not a banker. He's going to say, I need, you know, usually 50% up front, pay me 50% when I'm done. Some of those bills can be pretty substantial, and you as a homeowner have to come up with that money kind of right away. So it's sort of the plan versus the thing you don't know. And then the other thing you have to think about with septic systems is, a lot of our lots here in the community are really, really small. And is there a space to really put in a new system? Would you need to get a variance because you can't, you know, there's distances, it has to be away from property lines and your neighbors and other things. Do you have the room? And then if you're, remember we were talking about sort of the ground, the conditions under the ground, you're relying on the soil to do that treatment. If the soil condition is not acceptable, you'll have to import soil. That's expensive. So I always try to say to people, you kind of have to weigh and balance those costs. Nothing is free, but that's, you know, that's the way that it works. And again, just to emphasize, it would only be those properties that would be within the actual district, and those are properties that are benefited by the system that would pay for the system. If you're not in today's water district or in that general area, the cost of the system doesn't affect you.
I want to piggyback on something that you said about this district formation process. When it comes to a vote, you have to specify what the boundaries of the district are. Who's in, who's out. And that's a moving target right now. There may be some people that want to join that haven't said anything, or people who are adamantly opposed that maybe haven't said anything. And not that everybody's going to be able to accommodate everyone, but I think everybody needs to be heard if they want to be in or out, and they're not in or out. Because those boundaries, once they're fixed, that's what you're voting on, those are the boundaries. But the other thing that you have to say is it's going to cost the typical household, and there's a definition of typical household, 4 people,
well,
not sure what
it's
else
worse
it is,
than that.
but it's a 4-person family. How much is the typical household going to have to pay for this estimated cost to the typical household? So you're actually voting on a dollar amount. If you're not typical, you may pay less, you may pay more, but that number is part of the district formation documents before you go to vote.
Right.
As is the boundaries, the map has to be clearly defined.
Right, exactly. And so for the typical household, because, you know, the government came up with this, get this, the definition of the typical household is the mode of the assessed valuations of all of the properties within the district. So we're back to statistics. Candace was explaining median, which is line them all up, pick the one in the middle. Averages, add them all up, divide by the number, average. Mode is most frequently occurring. So you take all the assessed values of everything in the district and you try to find the one where there's 2 or more. Most of the time, in our work, again, we like statistics, the modes are multimodal, meaning that there might be 3 or 4 at one number, 3 or 4 at another number, 3 or 4 at another number, and these are assessed values of properties. So while we do that analysis and we provide that information because the state tells us we have to, we also kind of go above and beyond. And we will provide what we think is the most reflective of the cost to what we see as the typical, not the mode of assessed values, but the actual typical residential properties. Sometimes we do more than one. Sometimes we'll do, depending on how the fees are going to be assessed, the charges are going to be assessed, we may say this is the typical cost to a single family residence, this would be the typical cost of an apartment. If they're different, they aren't always. The other thing, and Tracy does a lot of this work, while it's, again, not required by the law, one of the things that we can often do is literally take every single property, as Candace said, we're going to have a boundary, we're going to know exactly what properties are in. We can pinpoint right down to Mr. and Mrs. Jane Smith and John Smith, who live at 123 Main Street, are going to pay X dollars. Now, that's not required as a district proceeding, but sometimes we find that information is extremely helpful to people to understand. So we can do that, and we have done that.
If you have the water usage data.
Yeah, we have water usage
You gotta have the
data.
usage data, otherwise you're guessing how much water you use. But usually your sewer charges are related to your water usage, so that's why she's saying that you could tell what
Right.
your bill might be, because you're gonna have a
Right.
usage component to that.
Exactly. So we can do that. But that's exactly it. So you're not, in the big picture, are you voting on some giant number to build the thing and operate and maintain it? Yes, but in reality, it's really what is that cost to the user? Other questions?
Ask the people there if they have
Yeah, do we have questions from Zoom or WebEx?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, when you say the cost of this, would everybody be paying the same amount? Or like a monthly fee, is that what you're saying? Everyone would pay the same amount, or are you basing your payment based on your income that you collected, that information?
That's a great question. So it's definitely not based on income. So there's a bunch of different ways that sewer costs can be assessed. They can be assessed on the basis of what's called an equivalent dwelling unit, meaning the lowest common denominator analysis of a single family home. So you could have sewer charges that say, okay, a single family home, you can look at the water data and say a single family home uses 200 gallons of water a day. That is going to represent 1 unit of payment. We're going to add up all the single family homes, they all equal 1. We're then going to take every other land use, and they're either going to be a multiple of 1, say it's a restaurant that uses the equivalent of 400 gallons of water a day, it would be 2 units of payment. Or we could say, here's a barber shop that uses 100 gallons of water a day, it's half. And we can assign cost based on that distribution. So in that case, everyone who lives in a single family home is going to pay exactly the same thing. That's one method that you can use. Another method you could use is you could say, okay, we're going to base it on how much water you use, because water in equals sewer out. I know people feel like there may be some consumptive use of water in their homes, but really, other than perhaps lawn watering or filling swimming pools, there really isn't. Pretty much what we see when we do studies is water used equals sewer generated. So we could say the cost is based on the amount of water you use. In that case, if you're very conservative, you may pay less than someone who uses a lot of water, who has maybe 5 kids taking showers all the time, could possibly pay more.
Right, okay, that makes sense.
Right. So the decisions to be made about how it's charged how the costs are charged. There are some rules that we have to follow that are in state law. They say that we have to charge people based on the benefit that they receive. So that you can interpret pretty broadly, but a lot of people look at it in those kind of two terms that I just said, either on the basis of their land use and put everybody who's in the same land use category together, so all the single family homes are together, the apartments are together, or maybe it's based on the amount of water you are contributing, meaning the amount of water you use. Those decisions would be made during the district formation process, so that when, as Candace said, when you get to voting, you will know the method, it's called the method of assessment, that will be used to charge people. We are big on transparent, so everyone should always be able to know why they are paying a bill for a certain amount of money. They should be able to go and understand what's the budget that added up to get to the money and why is my chunk some dollar value. We really like transparent, and we also like simple and straightforward. Because the more complex it gets, the more burden there is on the municipality to do it, and the harder it is for the public and everybody else to understand, well, why am I paying this bill? I don't understand. So that would be part of this process.
Okay,
That's a great question.
all right.
Other questions from WebEx?
I actually have another question.
Okay.
If somebody else wants to, did somebody else raise their hand?
I think that's you. I don't.
Oh, okay. So, with the flooding in the village, is that going to be a barrier to this? Or what is going to be the mitigation process for flooding to make this successful in Salem?
That's a good question. So flooding in and of itself isn't a barrier to having a sewer system. We do take the groundwater conditions and the conditions of the creek into consideration when we're designing a sewer system. In light of those things, it's not a barrier, and a lot of people would argue that eliminating septic systems in a community that floods is an environmental benefit, because those septic systems that are getting inundated by floodwater are not functioning properly. Even if it only happens every once in a while, they're not functioning properly. So that's a benefit. Flood mitigation in the grand scheme of things, like how do we address the White Creek flooding? Tracy, say something brilliant that no one has said for the last, right? When was the first structure bill here? 17 something? Yeah, it's been a little while. But I don't know, do you have anything you want to add about flood mitigation in general?
Just in terms of the wastewater treatment plant,
Yeah.
there are things that can be done to flood-proof it,
Oh,
or
yeah.
to keep it out of the floodplain, and there's siting determinations
Exactly.
and things like that for the plant itself to enable it to keep working during a flood or to recover quickly in a flood. That's the only thing to add.
Right, but I think in terms of flooding in general, that's a really big picture. I think we've talked about this before when we were here once before. I think, one of the things you saw when Tracy had her maps up, I hope you were able to see it, is that the watershed doesn't follow municipal boundaries. The watershed follows the topography of the land. So this is going to be, working on flooding and flood mitigation is a multi-jurisdictional process. It's going to involve a lot of people outside of the town of Salem to really get at the heart of the issue. The water in the White Creek doesn't start in Salem. It starts someplace over in Vermont. I'm not even entirely sure where, but I know it starts someplace over in Vermont. So things people do in Vermont and along the way will impact what happens here. Things you do here will impact what happens to people downstream. So this is a really big picture kind of approach to look at flooding in the White Creek. I remember I pointed out, I pointed out a couple things. I pointed out that the floodway should, and Tracy did too, that the floodway shouldn't be inhibited by structures. The floodway, remember, is that part that's moving. The floodplain is the part that goes up and down. The floodway is the part that moves. Well, here's our reality. Our floodway is inhibited. The railroad crosses it, I don't even know how many times, right? And numerous times. Every place there's one of those structures, those things that hold it up, those abutments, are in the way, right? Every time you have a road that goes over that has a bridge, depending on the opening underneath that bridge and the stream condition in that location, that could be another barrier, right? So the water hits it, it can't go under it, so it goes around it. That causes flooding. It also changes when you channelize something. We have some areas that have been created rather than letting it meander. That just delivers more water more quickly to some location downstream. So a lot of times you'll hear, I know after flooding events, you'll hear people say, well, I'm going to go in and clean out the creek and I'm going to harden the creek, and there's all of these words people use, right? And you'll see people come in with giant rocks and put them along the creek. Well, okay, that might protect some erosion in a particular area, and Tracy, you should jump in, or other things like that. But one of the things that that process of cleaning and hardening does is increase the speed of the water and deliver it more rapidly downstream. So you might get away from your property, but you're creating a problem for somebody else. So there's going to be, to really address flooding here, there's a big picture discussion to be had about these barriers that are there, and they're unintentional. It's not like the railroad came and said, gee, let me cause flooding, or that the road bridges, but when road bridges, and Sue and I were talking about this earlier, when the bridges are being considered for rehabilitation, one of the really important things should be evaluating the hydraulics of those structures. It was okay 20 years ago, and it's not so much today. It needs to be addressed. So that's one aspect of it. I think working with property owners, the White Creek goes through private property, a lot of private property. So working with property owners so that, when folks come in and decide to do that, those sort of hardening activities, understanding what the impact is of doing that hardening, again, may seem like a better idea on your own property, but it really does cause downstream problems and challenges. Obviously, not building things in your floodway is a big part of it. Those kind of things. So
Big culverts.
yeah,
Culverts and bridges is the same.
culverts, culverts. Another part of this, and we haven't really talked about this, but is right now all of our stormwater infrastructure here, I would venture to guess, is what we would call gray infrastructure. That means it's catch basins. You go out in the street and you see that catch basin. It's got a gray metal CMP pipe that gets the water. The intent is to get the water away from the road or the sidewalk or whatever as fast as possible and over to the stream, right? So one of the things to think about that can reduce some of the localized flooding is looking at green infrastructure, which is natural systems that slow down water, that absorb nutrients, that rather than this idea where we're going to direct it away as fast as possible, which just again causes a problem someplace else, maybe we could retain it and then have it slowly percolate into, the groundwater table to look at soil conditions, because we need that to work. But there are things that can be done. But it is not a simple, easy thing, and there is no one solution. Yard drains that are dry wells, right? Do they work?
Village roads, that's what they are, they're just.
Well, and I know we have a lot of wing gutters. Those concrete guys that go like this one side of the road. So do those work? Do those yard drains with?
Well, they're in the street, heavy stuff, no, they fill up like that.
Yeah,
We're talking, my home has had water this deep,
yeah.
raging around both sides. Okay, we're not talking.
Oh, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, yeah, understood. So that's definitely something, that's a big picture stormwater question. So a lot of communities do not permit those, so what I call a yard drain with a dry well, for that reason, because it's only as good as its ability to infiltrate below it. You have the set volume of water that can fit inside the drain, whatever that is. It's not going to be much. It's probably not even a rain barrel work. So that's definitely something to be considered. Okay, I guess.
Okay, well, as we said at the beginning of the evening, this isn't the last meeting, so we've gotten a lot of opportunity to learn a lot, and also, I guess the most important thing is to learn the process that we're faced with, and the hills we have to climb in order to get to a point where we have a possible project. If there are any final questions for this evening, I think, go ahead. Otherwise, we will take time to digest this, also to get the rest of our surveys in that we have to get in, and go on to maybe another meeting in a month or two. And probably more like a couple of months, when we've got some more information to share and some more questions. People will think about this and come up with some more questions.
Thanks for coming tonight. I can't thank you enough, and I know you have a long drive home, and I can't believe the amount of time you've been